Hey everybody, welcome back to another JBoz Gaming video. This is your host, Gunner JBoz, and today I'd like to talk to you about +1 -1 matchmaking. This will go under the good, the bad, the ugly, and the truth playlist. Obviously, this is a topic that is going to have a bit of a rant, but still is something that we as a community need to continue to talk about. As you may or may not be aware, +1 -1 matchmaking refers to, in World of Tanks console, the matchmaker that determines who goes into a battle, determining that the battle will be made up of tanks of a single tier, and then it might have an additional one tier higher or one tier lower. So, for example, if you're playing a tier 6 tank, then that match would be made up of tier 5, 6, or 7 tier tanks in order to play that match. Today, the matchmaker does not work that way, and the community has clamored for this +1 -1 matchmaking. And to Wargaming's credit, they've run tests on the +1 -1 matchmaking. And what it does to the matchmaker in low volume, high volume situations. And Wargaming is claiming that it is not beneficial, or it's too difficult for the matchmaker to make a match, i.e. it takes too long for the matchmaker, and some people might time out of the queue before the matchmaker can formulate a match for them and put them in a game. So let's kind of dive into this +1 -1 conversation. Let me try to at least make sure that everybody has the same understanding, and then we can talk about the merits or lack thereof. So today in World of Tanks console, the matchmaker it varies by tier today. So if you're in a tier 1, and yes, they do exist, you can't purchase them any longer, but if you're in a tier 1 to tier 4 match, then the matchmaker considers your tank a +1 -1 situation or tank. For tier 1, it's only +1. There's no minus, right? There's no tier 0 tanks. So if you're in a tier 1 tank, you can be placed in tier 1 or tier 2, or against tier 1 or tier 2 tanks in any match that you might be put in. And the same is true of tier 2, in the fact that you can be placed in a tier, with tier 1 tanks, and you can be placed with tier 3 tanks. So it's a +1 or -1 situation. So tiers 1 through 4 basically are treated all the same, and you have a +1 -1 situation. And the reason that's good is that's for hopefully for less experienced players that usually play in those tiers. They don't get matched against tanks that are much better equipped to, especially since they have limited knowledge. The tank's abilities matter even more, right, in these lower tiers, and so therefore they're not being overmatched with higher tier tanks, hopefully giving new players a better shot at having success in those tiers. So I don't think anybody would want to or see that particular situation change. So we do have +1 -1 matchmaking up to tier 4. Now, when we get to tier 5, it gets a little weird. Tier 5 and 6 are considerably different in that you actually have +2 -1 matchmaking, meaning if you're in a tier 5, you can find yourself matched against tier 4 tanks, tier 5 tanks, tier 6 tanks, and tier 7 tanks. So notice that if you're in a tier 5 tank, you can face one tier lower than you, or you might be facing a tank that's 2 tiers higher than you, meaning a tier 7. And the same is true of tier 6. Tier 6 only goes down to tier 5, but can be placed in up to a tier 8 game. So therefore, the matchmaking for tiers 5 and 6 are +2 -1. So actually, if you think about it, that's almost the worst tier to play. So once once new players graduate out of the +1 -1 tier grouping, they're placed in one of the worst situations where they're actually, facing higher tier tanks more often than lower tier tanks. And so the matchmaker is kind of geared towards punishing them actually at tiers 5 and 6. And then we go to tiers 7 and 8, which are true. They're the true +2 -2 that everybody thinks everybody else gets. So tier 7 can face 5, 6, or tier 7 tanks. They can also face tiers 8 and 9. So quite a range of different tanks that you might be placed in a match with at tier 7. And of course, this is true of tier 8 as well. The only difference is 8 only goes down to tier 6 and goes as high as tier 10. So, and arguably, 5 and 6 is a bad situation, but obviously this situation isn't the best either, because you can be placed 2 tiers up, and potentially against the highest tier in the World War II mode, you would be at tier 8 being placed against tier 10 tanks. So some people argue that's the worst situation, is the +2 -2. Going kind of rounding this out, at tier 9, it's actually advantageous for you, because the most you will face is a +1 situation where you have to play against tier 10 tanks, but you will also be placed in matches where you're a tier 9 and maybe playing against tier 7 tanks. So it's a -2. So it's +1 -2 at tier 9. At tier 10, it's the most advantageous, okay? So you're placed at tier 10, and the highest you're going to be placed against is tier 10, because that is the top tier in World War II. But it's a -2 situation. So as a tier 10 tank, you might face off against tier 8 tanks or tier 9 tanks. They can be in your battles. So this is the most advantageous situation. So we go from the least experienced players and the least, I guess, skilled tanks, if you will, at tiers 1 through 4 at +1 -1. So kudos there. I think that makes sense and it works. But then you kind of go to the worst situation for probably the next 2 tiers, in that you have a drastic increase in the higher tier tanks that you could face. In 5 and 6 are +2. Tier 7 and 8 are also +2. So you got to trudge through all of that just to get back to a more advantageous situation at tiers 9 and 10. So if you're, someone that's played this game a long time, has acquired some skill, grinded up the tech trees, got yourself a tier 10, and that's all you play, well, of course, you're always playing the best situation for the matchmaker for you, because the highest tier that you'll ever face is another tier 10 tank. So, all things being equal, the game should be balanced. So, that's the current situation in World of Tanks for World War II. For Cold War, it's a little bit different in that you don't have tiers in Cold War, you have errors. And you don't face tanks outside of a particular error. And so you do face tanks within that error. So it could be a plus situation every error that you're in, but at least it's generally the same. It's the same increase no matter what error that you're in. So Cold War is not really the issue in that everybody faces the same thing. No matter what error you're in, you have the same chance to either play against a lower tank or an upper tank. You're playing against those tanks in that error, and that's who you're going to play against. And generally, there's about 3 levels in each error. So it's like again, if you're the lower part of that error, you have the most disadvantage in that you're playing potentially against tanks that are two kind of steps up, if you will. But that doesn't last long once you move to the middle. It's basically +1, -1, and then eventually the top part of that error is again an advantage. I would flip that. I don't know why you play that way, especially with the first era. The most, again, that would mean that the most experienced tankers that have progressed to the higher tank now have a matchmaking advantage. But I will not speak on Cold War. There's better experienced people that can do that. But in general, +1, -1 really is referring to, for the most part, World War II and how the matchmaker works there. Now, these trials that I mentioned that Wargaming has been doing on the weekends here and there have been fairly successful in that, I have not, and I play quite a few matches. I have never timed out of a queue. There probably are situations where in order to not time people out of a queue, people are put into a match with bots because they need to make a match, and so therefore they generate the tanks they need, and they go ahead and create the match. Now, perspective and opinions are all relative, right? When I started playing World of Tanks 8+ years ago, timing out of a queue was, I wouldn't say it was very common, but it was common in that you would wait 5 minutes in the queue, and if there weren't people online ready to play in the tier that you're looking to play, you would time out. You would wait 5 minutes, and then you would have to jump back in the queue and start again. And though that was at times frustrating, I would much rather have that situation and wait for the match that's going to provide me entertainment and fun versus a match where, my tank is clearly outmatched with other tanks. So, in situations today, this occurs somewhat commonly in that, and I'll just use Tier 8 as an example. Maybe you are platooned with somebody in a Tier 8 tank, and you get put into what we'll call a Tier 10 match, meaning that there's Tier 10 tanks in the match, there's Tier 9 tanks in the match, and then there's Tier 8s, which include you. In this match, more than likely, it's going to be mostly 10s, potentially, mostly 10s, mostly 9s are going to make up, again, most of the match, especially if you're playing 2 tiers up. It's rare that you get matched with 10s only as a Tier 8 tank. Though it does happen, it's rare. But what I'm saying is if you add all the 9s and 10s together, most times the 8s will never exceed the number of 9s and 10s. That's the opposite situation that's even rare. And so that means that you're playing with fewer Tier 8 tanks, and you are the ones in that battle that potentially will struggle to first even penetrate the armor of a Tier 10 tank in a Tier 8 tank. Then even if you do pierce the armor, the weak spots, or that you're using premium ammo and you're increasing your pen rate just to be able to land a shot. Maybe you decide to use heat because you want to do some damage. The point is, the damage that you do is so little that it has no impact on deterring the enemy. Sure, there's tactics when you're playing lower tiers, and I do this in other videos that I've given for more advanced play, is when you're undermatched in this or overmatched in this case, you'll want to do some spotting. You'll want to track the enemy versus trying to damage the enemy. You want to be as annoying as possible, and that's pretty much all you can do in some situations. And so this is an example of why people in the community clamor for +1, -1, because they feel like in those matches, they really are in no competition to the higher tier tanks. And of course, the higher tier tanks love this because they know you're not a threat. They can sometimes completely ignore you, or some people even target you because you're the lower tier. You're the easier kill. If you're a less experienced player, why wouldn't you target the easier kills so that you get some experience and you get some gold, silver, and so on. So you would want to increase, right, what you do in that battle. And if you're not as skilled as maybe another player, it's much easier for you to take out the lower tier tanks, so some people target that. I personally don't advocate for that. I have a threat progression model that I talk about in another video, and that generally also includes you going after the threats in the battle first. And tier 8 tanks, if you're in a tier 10 game and playing a tier 10 tank, is not a clear threat, no matter what tank they might be playing. So you have to take that under advisement. But you play how you want, and this is how some people play, and it may work for them. So that's the +1, -1 situation, right? The community overwhelmingly, though Wargaming won't release any real polls, I believe overwhelmingly wants this to happen, where it's a +1, -1 situation. Now, technically, guys, we can already do this. There are a lot, and I do mean a lot, of preferential tanks. And what I mean by preferential tanks are that these tanks, if you're in these tanks and not platooned, or at least platooned with someone else that's in a preferential tank, you're guaranteed to be able to be in a match that's only +1 for you. So, for example, let's say I'm in a tier 8 preferential tank, and I'm platooned with one of my clanmates that's also in a tier 8 preferential tank. Then we can, when we go into the matchmaker, it is not going to put us in a tier 10 game, because that particular tank has been determined for the matchmaker that it won't play up into a tier 10 game. And so that's how some people are still getting the +1, -1 experience, because they know which one of these tanks is preferential. And when you're in the garage, and I've got another video that talks about how to know what tiers that tank plays, but when you're in the garage looking at a particular tank, it will say off to the left in the mid garage screen, it'll say something like plays up to, and then it'll have the tier of tank. But if you're in a platoon, it doesn't really work, because it assumes that somebody is not going to play a preferential tank, and therefore it will default to what the actual matchmaker defaults to when you're in a tier 8 tank. Now, if you're not platooned, you pick that tank, it should be correct. It should show that you'll only play, like, if you're in a tier 8 preferential, it'll show plays up to tier 9. Right? It won't say plays up to tier 10. But if you platoon with somebody with that tank, it's going to say plays up to a tier 10, even though they may, in the platoon, also pick a preferential tank. And if they do that, then the way the matchmaker should work is you should not be placed into a tier 10 game. And so if you have a third person in the platoon that picks a non-preferential tank, then yes, all three of you can be, and most probably will be, placed into some point a tier 10 game, because they take the platoon as whatever the best tank is in that platoon as far as matchmaking, and they treat that as the rule for the matchmaker. So how do you know when you have a tank that's preferential? Well, the only way that you visually can tell right now today is to go into your garage and look for a certain tier tank, and then see if it plays up to 2 tiers above it. If it does not, then it's a preferential tank. So technically, all tier 9 tanks are preferential tanks. Weird, right? So because they're a tier 9 and there's no tier 11 in World War II, they all are preferential because they only play 1 tier up. That is the same is true of tiers 1 through 4. They're preferential tanks as well, right? So there's tiers 1 through 4 and tiers 9 that are preferential. And then between tiers 5 and tiers 8, right, those tiers, those middle tiers, let's call them, there are lots of tanks, usually premium tanks, that are preferential. Just as an example, just off the top of my head, I know a Bogatyr, which is a tier 5 heavy, is a preferential tank, meaning that if you're in that tank by yourself or with platoon mates that are using preferential tanks, you won't play a tier 7 game. It's a tier 5 tank that normally tier 5s play up to 7, but because it's preferential, you'll only place tier 6 and below. So the key is to to begin to understand this and learn which tanks you can play so that you're experiencing +1, -1, and so on. Now, the whole principle behind this, or the concept behind this, is the reason these tanks were determined to be preferential was that they aren't powerful enough, so to speak, to play that high against that high of a tank, right? So, though I totally disagree with this on some of the tanks that are preferential, I think they're just as good as other tanks that are allowed to play against high tier tanks or higher tier, +2 tier tanks. So, that's a matter of my opinion versus what Wargaming determines as far as their playtesting, right? So, that's the situation today. So there is a solution on the table, and that is to play preferential matchmaking tanks. However, here's where I fall down on the whole +1, -1 thing. I don't understand why Wargaming hasn't moved to this. Well, let's be honest, I do, and I'm going to share that with you. The reason, though, the community wants this, and is probably the #1 ask of the community, if you ignore the rhetoric about artillery, because that's driven by community contributors and YouTubers, but if you just ask the overall community and they understand what the situation is, this would be their #1 ask, not modding artillery, but actually fixing this. So the reason Wargaming hasn't moved on this is usually when you're under-tiered, the way to also kind of buff your tank is to use premium ammunition, because premium ammunition on most tanks, not every tank, but on most tanks, increases the pin of your shell. So that, let's say I'm in a tier 5 tank and I get placed into a tier 7 battle, and my regular normal shell doesn't penetrate most tier 7s, I can use premium ammunition, and now that should be hopefully enough to pin the tier 7s, right? So a lot of people, when they get overmatched like that, they will load and use their premium ammunition to fight in that battle. And so, and that's a fair and reasonable tactic, but what that does is that generates the silver usage. So it drains the silver out of the economy, unless you're spending gold, and that's foolish. But it drains the silver, and therefore people have to earn silver, and they do that by buying premium, where you earn double silver, and so on. Premium time, not premium shells, but premium time. And so that's the way Wargaming makes money. And so they want to encourage people to buy that premium time, have more silver. And the way to do that is to have them use up the silver that they have by using premium ammunition and so on, and using consumables and other paid things that you go through in a battle and have to replenish on your tank. That's how Wargaming, the current economy, works. And that's why I made the video about the pay model, is because the pay model affects this issue as well. What incentive does Wargaming have to give us +1, -1 when that is potentially a very big revenue maker for them, is having people overmatched, and then having them use their premium, therefore buying premium time in order to get that silver and so on back. And so that's the real conundrum around +1, -1. Has nothing to do with whether the matchmaker will time players out, and they're worried about that and all that crap. That is just what it is. It's crap. If they have to put bots into a battle, okay, though I would love to really play against other human opponents, if there's just not that many in order to give me a fair match, I would rather have a fair match than I would against human opponents that are, 2 tiers higher in a tank that is overmatching my tank, right? Now, I personally, I think it is the #1 issue for the community, and I support that. I personally am skilled enough, for the most part, that I it's very rare that I feel like I don't have an opportunity to contribute to battle. Again, I find ways, even when I'm overmatched, to either win the game or help win the game or try to do something. But there are some battles where, and my teammate or my clanmates can attest to this, is like, there's nothing we could have done, guys. Can't even pin that tank with my premium shells, let alone, standard shells. Yeah, we're going to lose that one. We're going to lose it big, right? Because there's just you can't compete when the deck is stacked that much against you, right? Now, I'm not saying you can't have some success. You can't play well or do extremely well against tanks that are 2 tiers higher than you. There's many battles where I get a lot of damage in a lower tier tank against higher tier tanks because those higher tier tanks have more hit points. But you have to first know and assume that you can damage those tanks. And when you're in a battle that you can't do any damage, it doesn't matter how much you shoot or where you shoot. You're not going to have a great game, and your team is going to lose, especially if the matchmaker has not done a good job of balancing the match. And sometimes that happens. So that's what I want to say about +1, -1 matchmaking. It's a bit of a rant in that I'll also kind of classify this one under a lack of communication, because Wargaming should just flat out say that. They should tell the community, look, this is a big portion of how we generate revenue, and we have no incentive to change +1, -1 right now when we have no way to replace that revenue. And so it goes back to pay models, right? I know that's not a fun topic. We don't want to talk about it as a player base, but at the same time, it has direct impact on the +1, -1 situation. Unfortunately, Wargaming is not always a good communicator and at best dishonest most of the time. And so they don't tell us the real reason why they won't implement +1, -1. I think they are worried about matchmaking. I think they are concerned about queue times, as they should be, especially for those people that actually pay to play their game. But I don't think they don't have the capability. I don't think it's really a real issue with people timing out of the queue. I don't believe that. Even if some people would, on occasion, late at night, time out of the queue, and late at night means maybe that's a normal time somewhere else because the player base is in Russia and America, and you're in, I don't know, some Polynesian island, right? And it's daytime for you, but it's nighttime for the rest of the world or whatever, right? There's just going to be off times, and the matchmaker is going to struggle to make matches during those times. So by generating bots is one way to do it. So you shouldn't have to time out. You should be able to pull the bots in and make a game. And then if you do time out, again, it's only 5 minutes. And when we started playing this game 8+ years ago, that was not unheard of, right? It was not, I wouldn't say it was every time I entered the queue, but I would say maybe, I would say early on, it may have been even 3 out of 10 times I would get timed out of the queue. And maybe it was as high as half the time. I don't honestly remember, but I know it was not uncommon to time out of the queue. And so that's where we stand with +1, -1. Kind of my rant. Again, it's more about communication on Wargaming side. It's also bringing to bear the understanding about the pay model and how Wargaming makes money, or the lack thereof if they did go to a +1, -1 situation. And then also giving my thoughts on what a potential solution is, and that is to move to the +1, -1 situation for everybody, to do a different pay model, to reap the compensation in a different way. And you can watch my video on that. But it has to be done in conjunction with that, because you can't just implement +1, -1 and think that Wargaming can continue to pay developers to support the game and also develop new features for the game. It's going to end because no one wants to lose money. They're not going to pay us to play the game, and that's what they would basically be doing if they're paying for support and they're not reaping back at least a profit off of what they're doing. So that's it, folks. Hey, good luck out there and happy tanking. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.